This is Sirens, a new series brought to you by the ladies of Bombshell, where we dissect the institutions of American power. Join us as we sound the alarm on technology, governance, and national security issues, and maybe lure some men to their deaths. I'm Lauren DeYoung-Schulman.
I'm Erin Simpson.
And I'm Rada Iyengar-Plum.
And this week, as our special guest, we're going to have one of the co-hosts of Optimist Economy, which has some really absolutely fabulous regular beats that they do on their show. One of which is Terms and Conditions, which is about the word that they've had to look up recently. And the other is, I can't really call it, but it's like the executive orders that they would institute if they had the chance. Sometimes they pick their own. Sometimes they have friends of the show who are writing in and supporting them, which you're welcome to do for us too. Suggest ones overall. So in borrowing from that, before we get to chatting with Kathryn later, what executive order would you institute if you had the chance? Rada?
I sort of love this question, and I will confess I went in two directions, which is one was the extremely pedantic and one was the extremely sublime. So I will start with the pedantic, which is I'd like to ban the word innovation in any title. This is
my God, that's incredible. I love it.
You just cannot use the word innovation in the title. It must be struck out of all organizational names across the federal government. And I really feel like this would force heavy use of the thesaurus. And that would be a fun fact for everyone involved. The more serious one, and we will get to talk to Kathryn a little bit about this, is on changing how we actually measure the performance of the labor market without using unemployment rates. Because of course, unemployment rates have this denominator problem of people in the labor market, which makes you then worry about what happens to the disaffected people who don't want to be in the labor market. And so long story short, I think we should use a different way to measure how we're doing in the labor market for
It's fabulous. Erin, what executive order would you institute?
I only have a pedantic one, unfortunately, which is that I would like to ban the double space after periods in all government communication.
You're just wrong.
So,
Agree.
Okay,
I want two spaces.
Two spaces is how the Queen's English or the King. I mean, I don't care about the King. The Queen.
Two spaces is just about typewriters and fixed, fonts.
Yeah, but now it's become a norm, and norms have a place where when you're reading, it gives an aesthetic.
But not when they're no longer functional. No, it looks so weird on the screen.
Oftentimes when they're no longer functional, it makes it so much more aesthetically clear what is a sentence break punctuation and what is a sentence movement.
Well, I apologize for choosing the wrong executive order.
I just feel like the sentences look so crowded and like they're just uncomfortable and like they want their own space. Mine, I would pick, mine is, well, I guess it could have something to do with government, less so, is when every driver should get in their lifetime the ability to fully cut another driver off from their ability to drive for the remainder of the year. So... Yeah, so like and it's not like a dangerous one, but like, not like you're, kicking them out of the car instantaneously, but more your behavior has been so egregious on this particular time on the highway that you have been cut off for the rest of the year from driving. In this world, obviously, we would have to have like really, really good public transportation or otherwise. This is better than some of my original views around this, which involves like basically non-lethal weapons. But I think that like just the ability to stop one other driver from driving would like maybe add some caution to how people think about this.
I do feel like if you could tag them as like, like you get up votes and down votes. And when you drove around, you just saw people with all the down votes based on their driving.
That'd be great.
Now, I would have a lot of down votes, but also I don't
You might.
drive, so I solved that problem.
Just like as a bumper sticker, maybe.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's interesting. We had some things this week in It's a Drill that easily could have been actual dumpster fires. And they probably realistically belong there and in a longer term thing. But like they haven't quite resolved themselves yet. So we'll tee them up. It's a drill where we talk through issues that dorks like us talk through at cocktail parties or in coffee shops or otherwise. We're going to start out this week with we're recording on Monday evening of the 24th. As of Monday evening on the 24th, we do not yet have a Ukraine deal, and it's not actually clear whose deal it is exactly. But for that, we'll turn it over to Erin to learn a tiny bit more.
Yeah, there were a few things I thought we could talk about this week. There was a COP conference in Brazil, which was incredibly unproductive, it sounds like. There were some delicious articles in Politico about Bridge Colby last week, which honestly, if we had gone to any cocktail parties, I feel like that would have been a topic. The current status of the Ukraine negotiations, however, is dynamic, I think is probably a good word. So last week, there was a draft peace plan floated that seemed to require significant territorial concessions by Ukraine, and more seriously, at least to my mind, agreement to substantially reduce their armed forces. It appears that this plan was drafted between Steve Witkoff, who's actually the White House's embassy or the State Department's emissary to the Middle East, but has sort of taken over the Ukraine portfolio. He drafted that bilaterally with Russia, without Ukraine, without the Europeans, and seemingly without significant other portions of the US government involved. This last weekend, there were negotiations in Geneva, which my current reports seem to have brought the US and Ukraine a little bit closer together, but still with a lot of pressure to, quote, get a deal by Thanksgiving, which we may just note is a extremely American holiday, not one recognized by, any other capitals. I will say one thing that has caught my eye and that we'll want to keep an eye on, in addition to the substance of the deal, is the extremely weird factions that are pursuing things on the U.S. government side. So Witkoff had the lead in drafting, but Sec State Rubio, or the National Security Advisor, take your pick, was in Geneva. Meanwhile, the Secretary of the Army was sent to Kyiv to kind of break this to the Ukrainians. I don't really remember the Secretary of the Army usually having much of a role in this. And of course, as I mentioned, that the Europeans had been largely left out of the drafting and are extremely aggrieved at their current non-role in the process, as well as the substance going forward. So more to follow. We'll see if there's a deal this week, and we'll see if the deal is like something that's actually going to create any security for Ukraine in the future.
I really enjoyed the NPR cycle. Like, I must have been in the car early in the morning and then late in the evening when after the before and after the Senate briefing, or actually, sorry, just after the Senate briefing, and then a full day after the Senate briefing. And after the initial Senate briefing, there was a lot of leaks being like, "This is not actually a deal. This is just like the Russians' wish list." Rubio totally disavowed. And then, like 12 hours later, NPR was like, "The administration has said that we have gotten this story wrong." I'm like, this is incredible. Like, the Senate leaks like a sieve, and the entire administration knows this. Like, what the hell is actually going on with this? But anyway, totally agree with the weird negotiation shenanigans that are going on.
I will also just say, like, returning to my pedantry, I really enjoy the polite way in which the Europeans sputter objections to completely egregious exclusions that have been happening on this, where they're very nonplussed, but they can't quite bring themselves to be as bombastic as the current moment probably requires them. And so they're being very cross does not come across as quite as cross as they are.
Nope. Apparently no one cares.
Well, there's that too.
So my super glamorous topic was on the near final Schedule F rule. Who doesn't love to talk about near final rules? So it's not actually Schedule F. It is now Schedule Policy Career, which sounds ridiculous to say, but some news that came out recently ahead of making this actual final. The Office of Personnel Management circulated an early version of the final rule, which was original Schedule F, which would have converted or will convert a number of career positions to less protected or not protected semi-political style positions. And they basically, in this, assert that statutes protecting the civil service are unconstitutional overcorrections under the Constitution's Article 1. And like, it's kind of that's a lot of language for an interim or a near final rule reading. Like, usually that's kind of aggressive. The updated regulations cite that the president's authority under Article 2, I'm sorry, it was under Article 2. The president's authority under Article 2 of the Constitution, in the 1978 Civil Service Reform Act as well, and other laws that would protect from politicization. This is where the unconstitutional overcorrection comes in. They're basically saying, like, yeah, that's just not really valid. The president can effectively do whatever he would like in terms of hiring and firing the career civil service, which was kind of where we thought they were all going to go to begin with. And they're trying to make this play to make sure that the Supreme Court ultimately declares the civil service unconstitutional. They haven't made this play fully yet, but they're clearly laying groundwork. So the rule now states that employees that are transferred from into the schedule policy career, which is basically folks that they say have influence over policy, will no longer be protected by the removal protections that is in Title V. So that basically means that if you are accused of something or you're subject to poor performance accusations or any number of other things that may subject to removal, you would have adverse action appeal rights. You'd basically be able to say, like, nope, that's not true, and here's why. You'd have like the ability to argue your case. It would also unwinds the Biden administration's regs at the end of the administration, which were trying to block this new category's resurrection. What the other thing that's kind of irritating about it is that it relies on a provision about the in the Civil Service Reform Act that is clearly and obviously, according to everyone on the planet, including Congress, exclusively about political appointees. Like the president has the right to hire and fire political appointees. Yes, full stop. They're saying this also applies to the career civil service that works on policy issues. And that just doesn't make a lot of sense to anybody, but this is what they're justifying their case on, which astonishingly received over 40,000 comments. And those of you who work in the environment are like, whatever, 40,000. OPM rags usually receive like 1,000 at most. 94% of the comments that they received were opposed. And as opposed to making the administration rethink this or adjust their case in any way, instead it appears that their motivation was to double, triple, and quadruple down on their argument and to further justify why they think they're right. So the final version of the rule is still subject to agencies' feedback. I want to be real about this, though. Agencies are in a hard spot here in their ability to push back. I hope they do continue to push back, both in terms of legality as well as implementation. But they're going to be in a tough spot given the proclivities of this administration. So more to follow on Son of Schedule F, but not looking good.
It's so fascinating because for the government nerds, like, oh, the idea that OIRA, who governs this rules process, would have these bold and broad, like my kingdom for an OIRA that would make bold and broad statements about, I don't know, SF-86 reform or
right.
Like it's just
this
like,
is unconstitutional overcorrection. Like, really? Okay.
Yeah, it's such a bold set of statements that is so much further than what these offices typically do that it is something. It's something.
I know. Like their lawyers are. Well, let's just
they
say
ate their Wheaties. They ate their Wheaties.
They have, exactly. Yeah.
Well, mine is kind of a little bit on brand, which is focused on AI and the economy. So recently there have been a set of AI deals. Microsoft and Nvidia jointly invested 15 billion with a B in Anthropic, with Nvidia committing 10 billion and Microsoft 5 billion. Anthropic committing to a purchase of 30 billion, again with the B, of Azure, which is Microsoft compute capability, compute capacity, and using up to a gigawatt of additional capacity with NVIDIA chips. There are some additional deals with other providers, Nscale notably, to look at similar investments across Europe and the US, and a giant hyperscale campus coming in Texas. And so the question is, why am I citing large numbers of dollars and weird compute statistics at you? And the answer is not just because I love numbers and statistics, so that is also true, but because it's like we're at now hundreds of billions of dollars being spent on AI infrastructure across the US. And the theory that these companies are pushing is that these scaling laws that link model performance to training and compute availability mean that solving infrastructure bottlenecks in things like power access and data center capacity and GPU availability, which are basically the fancy chips that NVIDIA produces, are critical to making AI scale. What is tricky about this is that the AI infrastructure investments, and particularly these AI capital investments, are like a huge portion of GDP. So they're about half of the current US GDP. They contributed in the first half of 2025 to more GDP growth than consumer spending, which is an interesting inversion overall. And so now the question is, when you hear about people fretting about the AI bubble, this is the question, which is if that spending suddenly dries up and we don't see the returns, and just to be clear, the returns on this need to be like 100-fold increase over the current returns we're seeing. And yeah, then like you're not going to be able to get the growth flows you need to maintain growth. And so there's a lot of analogies to the dot-com bubble about whether the current investment levels are sustainable or represent an overextension. Um, and I'll just note there's a great daily episode on the AI bubble that makes this point as well, which is, of course, there's this question on the infrastructure investment and not just whether we'll see the return, but the timeline for the return. So if the returns don't happen soon enough, you get these massive economic impacts that can cause significant downturns, even if in the long run, kind of like the dot-com bubble, we did want these infrastructure investments, and sort of begs the question of these huge upfront investments. And the last piece I'll just note, and again, we're going to have a lot of conversation about the economy in the later section here, but is that there's a complete lack of transparency about the debt load that's being taken on to make these investments by a lot of the companies, especially the private companies. And that, we do a lot of comparing this to the dot-com bubble because it's technology. But actually, for me, I think the thing I worry most about is where are those debt loads? How are they spread across the economy? Because that's really what generates systemic risk. That's what we saw in the housing bubble, right? The housing crisis. And so less a question on the infrastructure and investment, which again, there is a risk of a mismatch in both time and level, and more of a question on if those debts are spread across more systematically across the economy and in a bunch of different sectors. And then you see a call in on those debts and failure to repay. That to me creates much more systemic economic risk. And so that's what I read about when I'm at cocktail parties. Here we are.
Just as a total absolute non sequitur, I saw that James Carville of James Carville fame, who is in his 80s apparently, is saying that Democrats need to move from a centrist economic message to an economic populist message. That, total non sequitur, nothing to do with what you just talked about.
I don't disagree.
Yeah.
I mean, he's the originator of the economy, stupid.
Yeah. All right, we are transitioning seamlessly into our dumpster fires of the week, starting with a recent visit that really was super annoying in terms of traffic, like more annoying than usual.
Oh my God, so annoying.
So annoying. When MBS, actually, it was funny. I was reading this. It's like, MBS, what does MBS actually stand for? Like, I just know these acronyms. MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, came to Washington for a series of meetings, a big dinner, and just like must have had 10 gajillion cars in the streets of Washington to block traffic over the course of the last week. So over to Aaron to talk us through that.
Indeed. Ruined more than one day of commuting for me. He was staying at the Waldorf Astoria, not far from my office downtown. I've never worked downtown before, and now I'm glad that I haven't, because it's really annoying when these things happen. I can't wait for the White House Christmas tree lighting, which is also a notoriously shambolic event. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, visited last week for, I don't know if we officially called it a state visit, but it was certainly had all of the elements of a state visit, including a lengthy readout and a sort of list of agreements and sort of a new mutual defense framework for U.S. and Saudi Arabia. Do you ladies want to tell us a few of the highlights from that new deal?
Yeah, I mean, so some of this is continuity, some of it, but it's worthwhile to call out the big distinctions here. So I'll talk through a little bit. So we've got in this new deal, a mutual defense framework giving Saudi Arabia more-ish U.S. security guarantees. That is something in writing and not just about selling stuff, though there is definitely selling stuff when it comes to the major non-NATO ally status, which is not actually a mutual defense agreement. It is actually more about selling stuff, but like I will leave that pedantic thing that always annoys me to hell aside. More F-35 sales and arms commitments.
First, like the initial F-35 sales, they were not previously approved. So I'm
yes, okay, sorry. The continuation of the intent, the intent to sale. Defense industrial collaboration. We have always sold them or worked them out in weapons, but this deal pursues more co-production and more training, etc. So more sort of get embedding and embedding. as well as, this is really interesting, U.S. support for Saudi civilian nuclear capabilities under non-proliferation constraints. And this is kind of furthering our friend Jared Kushner's great ambitions in the prior administration. Further Saudi movement towards normalization with Israel once Israel-Palestine conditions stabilize, which is, I mean, like, other people may have different views on this. I'm very much in the we shall see space. So, if Rhonda has anything to add on that before I offer my humble, not so humble opinion on the nature of any of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about these is that, well, two pieces. One is we're moving from a really, I will call it, transactional approach to like sort of different pieces of arms sales towards what is looking more and more like a, I don't know, formal security architecture.
Yeah.
So we're moving beyond these kind of conversations to something that's like, I don't know, a very forward leaning, explicit and binding approach with a non-NATO ally. And that's something that's particularly interesting given, the history, I'll say, with the Saudis. And so I think there's something interesting there. Obviously, there is also the piece in which this is very personalized, which appeals to both Trump's approach to negotiations and MBS's approaches to negotiations. So putting that together, it feels like a friends and family approach to security guarantees rather than the sort of ones we traditionally see that are more US interest focused.
Yeah. I mean, one thing just I'll add on that, to me, the deal, this is true of the Saudis historically, but feels more so with MBS, is that the nature of these deals with this administration, but also with prior ones, feel as though it's a deal with him as opposed to the deal with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which is not necessarily a huge distinction, but it definitely makes it seem as though we are investing in his sustainability and leadership. And interestingly, and I saw this and felt this a lot, and I saw the photos they had of the dinner and the a lot of the commentary that was surrounding his visit, is that all of these deals, which are, it's not dissimilar than what you see from other ally deals, it gets a lot of stakeholders invested in the success of MBS, of like people, like defense companies,
Yes.
not exclusively, but defense companies being a big one, but many companies finding that they get a lot of benefit by having this Saudi Arabia as a security partner, and seeing MBS's success as invested, or sorry, as important to that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, MBS himself has, created quite a reform agenda, both in terms of diversifying the economy in Saudi Arabia. We'll get to some broader strategic questions, but in particular, he's looking to, have basically sources of revenue other than oil. And this is, part of that, but this is also still just a lot of spending. They still have a lot of oil money that they can put against certain projects.
Including Silicon Valley projects and Wall Street projects and think tank funding, which kind of feeds the ecosystem.
Yeah, and I'll be interested to see just how much of these deals are actual investments versus just purchases, right? Like, is there actual like capital investment that's going to come across?
Yeah.
So one of the things that certainly captured the attention during the week of the meetings themselves was a set of comments that Trump made in the Oval Office, or at the White House, with regard to the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, who was a Washington Post columnist who was murdered in Turkey in October of 2018. The Saudis ultimately admitted that they had conducted the assassination, but said that MBS himself was in no way involved. Unfortunately for them, the U.S. CIA concluded that MBS definitely did give those orders, and the U.S. actually placed sanctions against 17 Saudis in that year. So there's a little bit of a question of, that was during the first Trump administration. Trump did defend MBS at that time, despite the report from CIA. How do we get from, and Rada, you touched on this just a little bit, but how did we get from there, this incredible nadir of U.S. Saudi relations, which, to be honest, have been kind of rocky most of our adult lives, being that we are basically 9/11 generation here. How do we get from that nadir to major non-NATO ally status, F-35 sales, a lot of cash flowing around, going in both directions?
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's just worth starting with saying, like, I don't actually think Trump was the pivot point. I think Biden was the pivot point here. Like, I think after the Khashoggi murder, there was definitely a big push against the Saudis and a big sort of outside outcry. But Biden, despite kind of the campaign rhetoric and so forth, the actual policy was really one of normalization. And he may have had different rhetoric, but in the end, I don't know that he had a hugely different approach. And so I think Trump's approach, like in a lot of things, is he's just removed what I'll call the rhetorical cover. Like he's not pretending like he's concerned about human rights or democratic processes. And I mean, there's an extreme version in which MBS is showing up in Washington in the same week Trump is talking about public executions of adversaries, which we'll get to later, right? So there's a real vibe to this that's consistent. And then in parallel, kind of as I mentioned earlier, MBS is doing things like investing in Silicon Valley. They've got money in a variety of funds and tech partnerships, investments in Wall Street. They've got think tank funding and partnerships. And so he's really trying to consolidate a combination of power and influence that makes it very hard for the US to pragmatically ignore and sideline in reality.
The additional thing I'd add to that is I just vividly remember the sensation, the feeling of after Khashoggi's murder, like the murder of a U.S. resident, an employee of the Washington Post, that a whole lot of folks were like, okay, this is it. This is the fight. This is the moment where we are going to finally, we as the United States are going to reject some of the actions of this regime, in particular this particular action, but also a number of other human rights violations. And I think that that dominated for a while, but it didn't last. And totally agree with you, Rada, that this was not just a Trump pivot. The Biden pivot was very obvious from the beginning because personnel is policy. Some of the individuals who were appointed as leaders in his administration always took a more accommodating approach to the Saudis. No matter what they said behind closed doors, in public, they were much more willing to think about this as deal making and trade-offs that they had to make as part of like the overall United States role in the world. And it was just really notable to me that the sensation of having MBS show up in DC, receive the welcome that he did, and have them both speak, or have Trump speak about this recently in the same week that Trump was musing about executions of members of Congress. It, like, to me, like, the vibes are just like very unsubtle, and we can partner. We think we can partner with the authoritarians without importing their politics, and maybe we can if we have particularly strong values within the executive. And maybe we can if we appoint people who aren't already captured. But if we do those things, or we're not terribly good at those things, it's going to be really, really damn hard.
And
Well,
I just like to put a fine point on it. I guess there's a version of this in which we have just accepted the pragmatism of the moment, and we can debate about whether there is value to the Saudis as a partner or not. But if you think there is, then the Trump version is really just stripping away the rhetorical flourishes and calling a spade a spade. And I don't know if that's exactly worse. It just is, but I think it's worth, calling that out.
so if we take a step back and think about, the degree to which Saudi Arabia really makes sense as a strategic partner. I mean, pragmatism has been the lifeblood of this relationship since, FDR and Ibn Saud, met in the 1940s. This is a relationship that is completely premised on the existence of oil in the Arabian Peninsula and the Saud's family's ability to extract that, for the benefit of the United States and the West more globally. The Saudi kingdom, the Gulf kingdoms have been a bulwark against Iran and sort of Iranian Shia revolutionary expansion in the region, and even against then some of the other, Sunni sort of Hamas led and Hezbollah led to the degree that was also sort of in the Iranian, orbit. So, there have been, long pragmatic or realpolitik, sort of vibes to the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia. Do we think that those still hold? I mean, is this still the place that future presidents should be looking to anchor a Middle East policy around?
I think my answer to that, I really don't want to be glib in this, and I'm tempted to. But my answer to that at the top is when we say strategic partner, under whose strategy? My general instinct is that the Saudis are playing us as a strategic partner, and that we are kind of the patsy in this without necessarily our own. We are more reactionary and pursuing this as a like by not. I mean, habits may be too strong a word. We're more reactionary to it, and they are more strategic in this. I mean, they definitely, absolutely matter in a lot of contexts in terms of their ability to influence regional dynamics, Israel, Iran, oil markets, like you mentioned all of them. But that it's not as though we can call them up on a regular basis and say like, "Hey, can you please do this thing for us?" Like that works certainly not all the time, not even the majority of the time, in a way that I would not assume a strategic partnership is premised. Not that like not that those partnerships are and they like always do what we're listen to us on. But like it definitely feels as though we are whereas we may have started in a relationship that kind of balanced between priorities, we're much more pulling consistently towards Saudi priorities. And I I I always had just this weirdest feeling when I was dealing with folks who work in this relationship in government that it felt more emotional and addictive than it did pragmatic, even if the pragmatism was in the talking points, that the underlying dynamics of it were more psychological or more like not in a way that I felt was terribly pragmatic. And that just may be my uninformed opinion there, but that's my impression.
I guess I'm in a, I don't know if it's a burn it all down or interrogate our foundations or something current mode, but my feeling on the Saudis is like really split. I don't think they can be a partner in the way we've had sort of strategic thought and value partners in the past, right? We don't have a shared history and shared set of values. I mean, actually, maybe we do, but I'm going to leave that sad side to the side for the moment and pretend that we still have democratic values. And so, like, in that sense, they're different, but that approach doesn't seem to be serving us terribly well over the last 2 decades. And so, there's a case in which like maybe we just have a narrow band and it's like normalization with Israel, right? And if we can get the Saudis to align without causing major escalations, then that's all we need from that's what strategic partners are. We have a strategic priority, they help us get it, and we can do it, and all the other pieces kind of be damned. And so, in that sense, maybe, but there does seem to be a lot of extraction that is a part of that initial relationship that just feels uncomfortable. Again, I'll note like there's a lot of you can call it extraction or you can call it support that happens for other strategic partners, whether it's Europe or Japan. So it's not that that's not part of these relationships. And so um I guess the question is the strategic thing they can deliver for us worth that extraction? And that I think is where there's still a lot of open questions for me.
It is totally unclear to me what strategic thing they deliver to us other than some vague control within OPEC on the oil prices.
Yeah. And
Like,
I
I
feel
don't
like
know
you
why we're lifting a finger for, normalization of Israeli-Saudi ties. Like, that sounds like an Israeli problem to me. And I don't know how that's going to like redound to our benefit per se, other than it's going to, keep Bibi in office a while longer in Israel.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a question of whether you think the structure and well-being of Israel is an American strategic priority. And I think that's and then whether this plays into that. And I think that's a two-part question. I think the first part is probably yes. I think question on the current government and whether the Saudis are key to that, of course, is kind of the crux here. But like there is a strategic interest in the Israeli state. And so I think the question is how useful are the Saudis in that and normalization with the Saudis.
Any final thoughts on the future of this relationship or ground we haven't managed to cover in this discussion?
Just to reiterate a point I made at the beginning is that MBS is very good as are other allies, but he is very good at building a dependency on but building a dependency not just amongst the U.S. government but amongst other U.S. sectors and stakeholders. so that they are invested in both the stability of the government and the partnership and continuing to up the ante on that. Like, that is certainly not unique to him. It's just notable in the sense of always be questioning what is actually driving the nature of this relationship and whether or not we should be stepping back to Aaron's point around why are we treating this as a strategic partnership when that seemed to have gone out of the way a while back?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that the question is exactly that, which is what can they deliver for us, and then are the costs worth that? And I think we probably don't ask that question as much as we should in the context of these strategic partnerships, whether they're longstanding ones or emerging and newly deepening ones.
Let's transition from one kind of mildly corrupt personalist dictatorship that has like bizarre influence over the judiciary system to another and talk about
Ta-da!
a lot. Like what's funny, we had to add two updates to the section today that won't be fully covered in terms of a newsy sense, but will be covered in terms of overall principles. And that is around what the hell is going on with the U.S. justice system, and across a number of different cases. So, Rada, over to you.
Yeah, so I think the overall wrapper I want to put on this is the judicial system is being used, and some might argue abused, for a variety of political and even not even political in a party sense, but personal goals by, powerful people. And we wanted to just dig in and think about both that in the context of the particular cases, but then in the broader context. So the two big anchor cases that are worth just kind of framing the discussion with are the Comey case, in which obviously Trump and Comey have been feuding. Earlier this year, the Department of Justice under Trump, led by Pam Bondi, announced that they were going to be prosecuting Comey. The prosecutors then engaged in a highly questionable approach to the case, led by Trump's former personal attorney, who had no criminal prosecution experience and apparently questionable legal expertise overall.
And apparently is not very
Uh,
good at her job.
She is
and
blonde, though.
that resulted in, but I think every other prosecutor quit rather than have to take these cases to court. So that was part of the dynamic leading into this. This led the missteps, and in particular, the lack of presentation of the full case to the grand jury, or questions on whether the full case was presented to the grand jury, then resulted in judges criticizing the prosecutors for a variety of procedural violations. Ultimately, this resulted in Comey's team challenging the appointment of the prosecutor and the overall case, and they were successful, and the case was dismissed earlier today, which is Monday, November 24th. So that's like one bucket of case, this Comey arc of what appears to, or what many have argued to be, a politically motivated case. The other one is the kind of ongoing saga of the Epstein files, in which Trump promised on the campaign trail to release these Epstein files, fueling and kind of added fuel to the fire on what powerful political figures might be there. But since getting into office, the Trump administration had largely stonewalled on getting this out. And so a group of bipartisan legislators led by a Republican, Thomas Massey, and a Democrat, Ro Khanna, forced the issue through a discharge position, notably getting votes from Republican stars like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert and Nancy Mace. And eventually, Trump himself supported the release, and the Epstein Files Transparency Act passed, and Trump signed it into law. The law, in addition to other things, had a number of abilities to redact or withhold information due to ongoing investigations. And so the Trump administration initiated a set of initial investigations the day after the law was passed. The documents have been released in batches. There's a lot of discussion. This is less about the substance of the documents and more about just the broader context in which these cases are politicized. So with that sort of like big piece of context there, maybe it's worth just talking about like what on earth is going on in the legal system, maybe starting with the prosecutorial process. So yeah, it seems like prosecuting your political opponents like wouldn't be a great look. But obviously, Trump himself was prosecuted after he left office, and he claims those were political. So, how are the Trump public calls for prosecutions, whether it's for Comey or other allies, versus the prosecution. What distinguishes these different types of cases?
The headline, and like this is really pretty simple, is that Trump did like on their face illegal things, and Comey, so far as we're aware, did not. That does not necessarily matter in our judicial system because there's potential for investigation and prosecution and so on. But that's one. Two is that historically, presidents really work really hard to not influence DOJ prosecutions. In fact, like there's all kinds of weird ass rules that usually go on in terms of how and whether you're allowed to call the Department of Justice on various things, even if they are clearly not prosecutions. But that is not the case now. The president seems to feel like it's totally cool to not only call the Department of Justice, but also like tweet about it publicly and be like, "Hey, go prosecute these people." So Trump would definitely say, or Trump would probably say, no matter what I just said there, that his prosecutions were definitely political and like that's a big deal, and he was attacked unfairly. This is what I'm about to explain is one of the reasons why I think that the justice system needs to do a better job at narrating its public process beyond law and order. Law and order is very helpful, but it's not the only piece here. Trump's cases, the cases against Trump, they involved career prosecutors and standard DOJ procedures and judicial review and lots of other stuff. And not, for example, his opponent's personal lawyer handpicked to target him. Or another way to put it as that DOJ was like insanely, obsessively, maybe overly cautious in the way that they initiated such cases, in a way that they had evidence evaluated regarding Trump, and that the way that they pursued it overall was kind of seen as like, wow, guys, you're moving kind of fucking slow. Pardon me, really freaking slow on this. Whereas Comey's began with a tweet, or maybe what do we call it on Truth Social? A truth, whatever it is, with Trump not just saying, I want this to be investigated, but here's the outcome that I want, and finding lawyers to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly notable the differences in process. I think it's also notable that, you know, there's a big cost to the Department of like being able to fire all of the attorneys until you find one that prosecutes it, and then pushing charges against someone or pressing charges against someone, which obviously has costs on the individual themselves. And maybe it's just worth taking a minute here to think about the harm, even if, you know, in the case of Comey, for instance, the case is dismissed on these grounds, like the various types of costs that people have to bear in these cases when you have a prosecution that is done for political rather than substantive motives.
Yeah, I think the biggest one that has been coming due is the cost to the Department of Justice, which is, if already at a point of no return in terms of building and regaining trust, will be at that point quite soon. Why on earth would we trust that the Department of Justice is able to make fair and appropriate prosecutions and investigations given what we have seen in the last year or so? In addition to that, thinking from a more personal perspective, the reputational damage and cost to those individuals who are unfairly prosecuted, like they can't avoid that. Even if it is self-evidently like they are not guilty, there's nothing wrong, they did nothing wrong there. The time, the cost to themselves, both in terms of resources, time, and just stress that comes with that, they can't actually get that back. That is baked in and is part of the strategy, I believe, that the Trump administration is pursuing here in order to create that dynamic so that even if the Trump administration loses, they have harmed their opponents in ways that can't be mitigated.
And I mean, I'm particularly struck actually just today. Obviously, there's been not obviously. Sorry, let's start that again. I'm particularly struck today. We're even seeing a recent direction that Hegseth is taking to investigate Mark Kelly, and who was one of the senators who said troops shouldn't disobey. Troops should be able to disobey illegal orders, which is actually just a statement of fact. And sort of being threatened with prosecution as a retired military official under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So there's obviously a clear directionality of these political prosecutions. On the other hand, we want to be able to hold politicians and former officials accountable if they do things that are wrong. So, where is that line between political vindictiveness and actual accountability?
Yeah, I just don't think that that line's that blurry. Like there has to be some sort of, apparatus that we agree with or agree upon that can at least determine whether there's enough evidence to like move forward with an investigation. And there's no evidence that James Comey committed a crime, right? Like there's no evidence that Mark Kelly committed a crime. Mark Kelly was in a video, right? These are like this is not the like bright line test or like, the line is, no less bright for being thin. No, like these are very clear to me at least, like political prosecutions. I think in some ways the better question is, to Lauren's earlier points about career prosecution and judicial review and all of the institutional protections that are going on within DOJ, none of that did anything to protect those prosecutors from kind of being maligned with people saying you're just going after, Biden's political enemies, that is to say, Trump officials and Trump himself. That didn't do anything to actually advanced the DOJ's case in front of the Supreme Court, who basically came back and said, well, "Presidential act, you can take classified material wherever you want." There like there's other. I feel like there's other sort of things in the system that are also rotting or rotten. That are preventing us from having a fuller set of accountability for elected officials who legitimately commit crimes either in office or on their way out.
I mean, I think that the thing that Aaron is pointing out here that is rotten in the system that our Department of Justice has historically done a bad job at is pointing out when the Department of Justice or others are engaged in a system that they know is going to find against them inaccurately or inappropriately. They don't pre-bud that. Like they just sort of like go about it as though the game is still fair, even when the game is deeply unfair. And we see that in a number of jurisdictions where we have an increasingly partisan judiciary that is like at the state level or elsewhere, where you have former appointees who are not calling balls and strikes. They're just there to call for their particular political team. So instead of like noting that that system is invalid, which we're starting to see a number of officials do, people just like treat it as though it's entirely fair, and they don't pre-butt. They don't out and go and say like, here's what's going to happen next. Here's what's going to happen that is going to be a corrupt version of this system. Instead, they just treat it as normal and as though like this is going to be totally fine. To Aaron's previous point on like the blurry line here, I think the key point to make though is that it is actually, I believe, possible to have politically sensitive cases still entirely be valid. Like, and that I'm not saying that Comey's case was an appropriate one to pursue. I'm saying that if Comey had committed a crime, then absolutely possible to pursue politically sensitive cases. And actually, it is better to do so in as much as possible. So we are in a system where everyone is held accountable, but with that basis of evidence. And our Department of Justice is just frankly not really good at like the comms game. And I say Department of Justice, it's not just Department of Justice. Our broader legal apparatus is not as good at the comms game as those who they are fighting against.
Well, I think maybe the way that I would frame that, Lauren, is, the career prosecutors, and for reasons that are, kind of obvious for professional reasons, see the game as occurring in the courtroom. Whereas many of those who are, either bringing these cases now or were fighting against them in the Trump administration saw the courtroom as merely like one, chess piece on a much broader board. And in fact, the real board is in the media, the real board is in public opinion. And so you can shape all of those things through, I mean, this is basically like the, Gawker lawsuit, but for political prosecutions, right? We're going to bankrupt individuals. We're going to ruin their lives. Therefore, we'll create incentives to prevent people from doing any more videos with senators criticizing, the potential for unlawful orders or anything else against the administration. I think they probably are pretty effective in terms of that, right? So whether they got James Comey, I don't know, but I bet this attempt at Mark Kelly, it may overstep the mark, but I bet it has the chilling effect they want on Senate activity in the near term.
And just to pull this sort of parallel thread on the Epstein files, obviously, Congress forced President Trump to release them. And so, kind of, this is a slightly different version of this politicization of judicial cases and investigations. But does that does that change the nature of transparency and of releases overall? Like, normally we would think transparency in some of these situations would solve it. Now you've got a highly politicized version of transparency in and of itself.
I mean, like,
Thoughts?
transparency comes with gatekeepers. And like that's always true, but in this case, it's particularly true that when you have the gatekeeper of either Congress or this administration who is making deliberate choices about when, where, how, and to what end they're actually making releases, it's hard for that to be neutral because they control that context. And that's why, like, this entire back and forth between Trump and Congress has been so stupid. Like, they've had the power all along. They didn't need to have this like long dialogue. And yet here we are, but it's a fascinating kind of message in terms of what they're saying to the Trump administration.
Well, and I also think that there's, this is on the one hand is a bit of the snake eating its tail, right? So, the point on transparency is that Trump campaigned on releasing these files for reasons that aren't entirely clear to me, other than there was clearly a part of his base that was motivated by it, and so maybe he was, playing to that part of the base, which usually he's quite good at doing. And then it just, I think basically people started doing the redactions, and it came back like, this is not going to look good, boss. And so they tried to walk it back. And I think what's interesting here is not just the dynamic with the congressional coalition, but it's one of the first times you really see Trump being out of step with the MAGA base, right? Sort of missing the MAGA vibes, which usually he's both good at reading and shaping. And on this one, he was really caught flat-footed. And which is why you have sort of this back and forth with Congress. But I think in terms of the releases, yeah, I mean, there's that's the problem with being driven by a conspiracy theory as well, is that they will always think that there are more files that you didn't release, that the real answer is in the secret files. And that's endless, right? Like, that doesn't really get broken by good process, by career officials, by clear standards, right? And so that remains, I think, a challenge of the broader political discourse.
So maybe just like closing us out and connecting these, we're seeing, selective prosecution, selective transparency. Maybe these are two sides of the same coin, but how should we think about this kind of in a going forward sense? How much should we care? How much should we worry about what we're seeing here as a sort of bellwether of future concerns or future problems?
But we should care a lot, I think. I mean, if there's no distinction between the White House and the DOJ on prosecutions, the power of the federal government to investigate people and ruin their lives is pretty substantial. And if that's going to be done, based on whims and quite sort of political hit lists, that undermines a lot of core notions of all of our participatory, democracy. I think it creates, again, deliberately creates that chilling effect, both against speech, but also against, potentially organizing against the administration.
Yeah, and I for a number of reasons know a lot of people that have been targeted by this administration, either openly, tacitly, by name, or by category. And it has been eye-opening, terrifying, horrifying to see that chilling effect in real time and realize how much it is impacting people's day-to-day lives, both the fear that they experience, the risks that they perceive that they have to take, and the choices they have to make in terms of appropriateness to push back because people have not done so in the past. And it's one of the reasons, not the only reason, I've been that over the past 6 months or so, whereas I spent a lot of my time around like, what do we need to do to reform the federal government? To me, the biggest priority is we need to reform the justice system, like full stop. Like, there's just like a lot that needs to change, both in terms of the legitimization of the work that they do, but also the shape, structure, form, and way that it operates that will be necessary for any kind of substantial political change that we want to see in the future, but also for that rebuilding of trust that is necessary for a democracy to be able to function. I think it's just really, really hard to unring the bell that not only the Trump administration has rung, but like certainly they've been ringing it really loud and all the time on social media over the past several months.
I totally agree. I think just in kind of closing us out on this section, I I think the downside is we are at a point closing in on points of no return on the credibility of a number of institutions. I think on a slightly more optimistic note, like there are other systems and there are other approaches to trying to drive accountability that don't rely on this particular structure of judiciary. And I think we may need to, at least for a period of time, think about other ways to drive independence and legitimacy and accountability to help rebuild that credibility in our judicial system, because absent that credibility, it doesn't serve as an effective third branch. And obviously, that's a really critical part of our system.
Well, let's cheer ourselves up with some talk about the economy.
This week on Warning Signs, we're so excited to have our guest, Kathryn Edwards, who's an economic consultant and the host of the Optimist Economy podcast. So, Kathryn, welcome to the show.
Hey, y'all. Thank you for having me.
We are so delighted to have you, and I am delighted to have a whole conversation here on Sirens where we talk about economics. It's going to be so great.
I had
Brace,
to get
brace for impact, listeners.
Yeah. I had to get Rada's questions just to back off from the nerdiest of nerdy to okay, you haven't even introduced what that term meant. You actually need to give our listeners just the tiny bit of on ramp in order to figure out what on earth is going on as we let two economists go nerd out here. I should also say, Kathryn, we did as our question of the week or the episode rather, to introduce. I gave them options that we could either do what you had to look up in the dictionary this week, or executive order. And we picked executive order and paid tribute to our Optimist Economy friends down south. Yeah, you're down south.
I'm down south. I'm in Houston, and Robin is in LA. So your Optimist friends in small, sprawling metropolises who are probably on a highway right now, and they're probably stuck in traffic because they live in LA and Houston. And you know what? It's not cold. So that's where they are.
We have two economists and two Texans, and it's hard to know which one of those things we're going to talk about most.
Totally. That is actually, that's a fair question. That's a fair point.
Well, so again, really excited to have you on. And really, we wanted to start by just kind of trying to look at what is actually happening in the economy. And Kathryn, you've written a lot about this, about the ghost recession, now the ghost recovery. And there's lots of talks about things like low unemployment or economic growth. But can you help us kind of understand why maybe the economy looks good but feels broken, and what is going on holistically in the U.S. economy?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Easy question.
Easy question.
Start off simple, and we'll build.
You know what? There. Cut me off at 30 minutes, okay? So I always think it's really helpful to zoom out. And if you zoom out and you think of America and its modern economy since World War II, we go through things called business cycles, where the economy grows until it starts to slow down. It enters a recession. We shed jobs. Things get, this is a technical term, rejiggered in the economy, and then we start to grow again. And we think of these cycles as being kind of a natural part of a capitalist economy. So we've had 13-ish, since World War II. And they always start with a recession. And the one that we're in right now started with the pandemic recession in March of 2020, where the U.S. economy ground to a screeching halt and shed over 22 million jobs in a matter of weeks. Unemployment shot up to officially 15%, but unofficially it was closer to 20. 1 in 5 people were looking for work. I mean, it was truly catastrophic. And the business cycle that kicked off has been weird. It just hasn't been like the ones that come before, not just because of the way that it started, but because of the way that the government responded to it, because of the way that people responded to it, the way that businesses responded to it. And it has only been 5.5 years. And yet we have lived lifetimes in this economy since the pandemic. And that, I think, is a good way to orient yourself into what's going on. And that ever since we started to recover from the pandemic, the question has been, when is the shoe going to drop and we enter a quote unquote real recession? This was one that the pandemic forced on us. But what about the one that we were supposed to have? The one that was this, just the economy slows down after it grew for a while. And so this has been this almost constant search and evaluation of like the recession is going to come, right? We're about to have it, right? And that is the tenor of economic conversations for almost 5 years. And we've had different candidates as to what has been the cause of the recession we think will come. Is it the recovery package, the inflation that spiked afterwards, or in the case of the most recent presidency, some terrible economic policy that the White House is pursuing? Is we've had different reasons for thinking the economy is going to decline, but we've been looking for it.
But we do see things like growth and some unemployment, some unemployment reduction. So what are these like sort of usually cited numbers on job growth or GDP growth? What are they missing about the economic reality?
Yeah. So the size of the economy is GDP, and getting bigger is better, and getting smaller is worse. Great. The ability of the economy to produce jobs for the people who want them is the unemployment rate. Higher is worse, lower is better. And these two things are kind of come together in the monthly jobs number, which is the number of jobs that the economy has created in the past month. And what's been happening for about a year is that we are seeing signs that the economy is slowing down, but they're not all happening at the same time. So like 1 month GDP will be really weak. And but then the next, or 1 quarter rather, but the next quarter it'll be strong. But in that quarter that GDP was strong, we have terrible job growth, but the unemployment rate doesn't go up. And now we're in a quarter where GDP is going to be strong and job growth is fine, but unemployment is starting to rise at a pretty steady clip. All of these things mean that the economy is slowing down slowly. So one way to think about it is where think of like cars on like a 4-lane street headed towards a red light, right? They're all slowing down, but they're not moving in perfect tandem. Like some car is going to get to the red light first, and another car is going to like maybe coast as long as possible before they have to brake. You can think of the economic indicators as they're all moving towards a red light, but they're not necessarily all stopping at the same time. That's really hard to parse. I mean, it's hard for economists to parse. It's hard for humans, just regular humans out in the world to parse, especially when it has to intersect with how they live their economic lives and what they see in their paycheck and in the grocery cart and their electric bill. And so that all comes together. I have my own version of why I think this is happening and kind of like what's really going on. But, you know, a lot of times, especially with recessions, we don't really have a great idea of what caused them until we're well past them. And it's in the wreckage that we see the real cause and not kind of in the slowing down.
Just on this point around that, I love the analogy there of the cars on the highway. I think that is an incredible way to think about this. So, swinging back to our earlier point, is this slowdown of kind of competing slowdowns that we're seeing? Is this what's coming before a full recession, or are we already in one? We're just calling it something else, or is this actually just kind of like I hate to say new thing because it's probably not a new thing, but is this a new moment that is complex? And this is one of the reasons why we're having a hard time describing it, particularly since public sentiment is also a factor here in terms of how any of these numbers or these impacts are perceived.
Okay, few things. One, we don't say that we're in a recession until we're like at least 6 months in. And we'll say it's the National Bureau of Economic Research Business Cycle Dating Committee. Great at parties, believe me. They basically meet to look at all of the economic data and decide if we're in a recession. And they always do it with a significant lag. Mm-hmm. So they didn't say that the U.S. entered a recession in 2008. They declared that recession in October to have started the prior December. There's a huge lag. And the reason why is because you don't want to automatically trigger a recession. Like one report comes out that is bad, and now we're in recession. That would instill panic. And it would also give us, less control over stopping a recession from coming. All of these indicators starting to like kind of blink red at different times, that should be motivation to intervene to prevent a recession from happening, which is why we have this distance. It's not just that economists get off on being withholding of economic intelligence and understanding. It's that we also want to give policymakers a chance to say like, hey, this isn't good, but it's not a recession yet. There's still time for you to do something productive in the economy to prevent one from happening. So that's where a lot of the uncertainty comes from, is that we could be 6 months in a recession before we find out officially that, yeah, this is definitely a downturn. but that's not necessarily for a bad reason. The other thing I would say is, I don't think that the news or the economic data has become harder to parse. I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind. One is the past 2 recessions we've been through, I don't know how else to describe it. They were big and bad. I mean, the pandemic recession, you knew when it started. It started that week that 4 million people applied for unemployment insurance because they'd all lost their job. I mean, the Great Recession, aka the financial crisis and foreclosure crisis, I mean, it was pretty obvious when banks were closing early so they wouldn't have a run on like the largest banking institutions in America that we were clearly in a recession. But the recessions prior to that, I mean, getting past the experience of most people today, especially young people, they creep up on you and they often creep themselves out the door. Like they're not as severe as the 2 we've went through. And it's hard for us to understand what a normal economic contraction looks like when the 2 worst recessions from the Great Depression were the last 2. Now, hopefully that doesn't become the norm. Hopefully these were just historical recessions that we get to walk away from and get to have our normal kind of bad, but not horrific recessions again. And they tend to come up a lot slower, tend to be not as quite severe, and we tend to get past them a lot quicker than we have. And so that's something to keep in mind, that we're not really accustomed to experiencing a mild recession. We've all been through unprecedented time after unprecedented time.
I think there's been too
We're
many
millennials.
generational
Really not
events.
fair.
I'd like fewer generational events.
Yeah, precedented. Give me precedented.
I love precedents.
I have one last cheeky question.
Yeah.
What is the worst economic take you have heard from a very serious person? And those are in all caps, very serious person lately.
Jesus, where do I start? Oh my God. So, okay, here's the one I remember most recently. Manufacturing has lost jobs over the year.
Mhm.
And this is like, we're going to have tariffs in order to have manufacturing. And like, it's shedding jobs faster than any other sector. And the White House press secretary said the reason that like manufacturing is doing okay because we posted jobs in construction. So like, you know what makes us have manufacturing jobs? That there's jobs in another sector. And I was like, whoa, honey, that's not how sectors work. So that one was great. The guy who they appointed to be at the Fed, I don't remember his name, but he's there. Yeah, he has the worst takes. I think, but someone, maybe the Treasury Secretary. No, it was Kevin Hassett, just said on TV that the U.S. debt situation has improved. That was the worst take I've ever heard. I'm like, man, but does it count as a worst take when they're just like so incredibly factually incorrect? Like, I don't know if that's a take. So I think the press secretary is saying that manufacturing is doing okay because construction is adding jobs. That is a take. Kevin Hassett saying the national debt is going down. That's just plain wrong. So I don't know if that counts as a take. I'm going to go back to, I know manufacturing sector is doing okay because we have construction jobs, which I'm sure is very comforting to all those manufacturers who have shed jobs. Like, don't worry, you're losing jobs, but the construction industry is gaining them. So actually you're fine.
Perfect. I'm sure that switching those sectors will be seamless and that growth will enable a happy future economy for us all.
Happy economy future, everyone.
So for Gong Show this week, God, both of these options are so good, but I'll do the first one. Well, in my heart, wanting to answer the second, which is to ask us all, what is our favorite slightly unhinged holiday treat?
What can you tell us about the second one? Because then I'm going to connect the two.
Oh my God. Okay. So the second one is, which Taylor Swift song would you sync to the Mamdani Trump presser? Which I just want to note that, like, I got multiple texts from people saying, like, are you watching this? I'm like, what are you talking about? And they're like, you must see this right now. So please go enjoy, everybody.
So my unhinged holiday treat is, as folks know, I like to put eggnog in my coffee. Indeed. But on the weekend, which is not unhinged, it's just a highly sensible approach to coffee drinking. But on the weekends, I like to put both eggnog and Baileys in my coffee. And let me tell you, folks, It is a delightful experience that I highly recommend. And I routinely want to do that while playing Look What You Made Me Do from Taylor Swift because my children wake me up very early on weekends. And so this, I feel like, is what I want for that Momdami press conference, which is just that. Look what you made me do.
I'm surprised your
Look what
answer.
you
Well, I
made me
don't.
do.
I don't know what I would have. Well, I have my own answer on the Momdami presser, but I thought your answer was going to be a Tom and Jerry. That is
Yeah.
an actual unhinged drink.
Oh no, that's a delicious drink. What are you talking about? Don't be crazy.
I have been looking for a Tom and Jerry
It's
mix
nuts.
all over the DC area, and I'm not able to find it. So if anyone can point me to the location, let me know.
And also, don't try to make it at home. So, for the folks who don't know, Tom and Jerry's is a whipped batter that is made of magical ingredients that no one shall know what are in them. But it is sugary and fluffy and sweet. And you mix it with, I think, a shot of rum, a shot of cognac, and a shot of whiskey. And then you put the batter, you stir it all up, and you sprinkle some nutmeg on it. And then you drink it and feel amazing. And you can get it from a variety of locations, but where we are in upstate New York, there are two good places. One is Etlof's Bakery, which is owned by the Swedes, as they say, and the other is Don's Car Wash. Just don't get it mixed up with the Suds mix.
Erin, what is your favorite?
I don't know
slightly
how I could
unhinged
even
holiday
begin
treat?
to compete with any of that.
No.
Like we're Midwestern. I don't feel like we really have like truly unhinged, treats. Like, I don't like eggnog. It is disgusting. I do like Bailey's. There are several other like winter holiday cocktails that I enjoy eating. But I don't really think that I can eat a lot of butter cookies. I can eat, I'm having a hard time thinking about anything particularly unhinged that, we enjoy other than I actually like green bean casserole, which really puts me in the minority.
Oh, I
these
love
days.
it. I love it. I bought my own French fried onions this week to make my own for my Friday Thanksgiving. I'm going to somebody else's house for Thanksgiving, but they won't have it, so I got to make my own.
What's your favorite unhinged treat?
Oh man, okay. So like there's just like a variety of options here. Like this isn't unhinged, but like I love snickerdoodles and like that's a Christmas time of year. I love fudge. I think my unhinged one is like I do love going to Aldi or Lidl during the holiday season and picking up all the weird German holiday treats that they have there. Which my favorite, which I believe I mentioned before, is Stollen, which is an enriched bread that has dried fruit and marzipan in it. Sometimes poppy seeds, sometimes apples, but usually marzipan is my favorite. And I what I've usually done in the past is go to Aldi or Lidl or Trader Joe's just before Christmas is over and buy like a whole bunch to keep in the freezer. And then I realize that I'm in my 40s and I can't do that anymore. All right.
I believe in you.
With that, I wish you all the best of unhinged holiday treats over the course of the next week. If you haven't given us a rating or a hug on your social media platform of choice lately, please do so, and we will catch you next time.